Salut, good morning. Do I have to do the shot of rum or am I good because it's 9 a.m.? I was told I had to do a shot of rum, but I'm okay to skip that because it's very early. So thank you for being here bright and early on a Friday morning to talk about mobile adware. As you heard, my name is Kristina and I am based in Toronto, although I'm very happy to be back in this beautiful province because I lived here for about 5 years. I'm a security intelligence engineer at Lookout, which is a mobile security, cybersecurity company with the main office in San Francisco, but we're kind of all over the place. Before that, I was an AppSec engineer for Shopify, and I was primarily responsible for monitoring the Android applications that were developed and making sure that vulnerabilities weren't introduced in those guys. I'm also a master's student, and I just released a course on LinkedIn Learning about analyzing mobile, specifically Android malware. So if you find this interesting and you want to get started, it's free, so that's handy. So there's a fair bit to cover, and I've got 50 minutes. So I'm going to be kind of brief, just going over what we're going to talk about today. The first thing we're going to look at, and I'm sure most of you know the term adware, but we're going to kind of dive a bit more into what it is and why we should even care about it. Then we're going to look at a particularly interesting case study that I worked on earlier in the summer. And we're going to talk about the aftermath of that case study and the future of adware and how that might impact us in the future, especially for researchers. So what is adware? Why should we even care about it? For anyone who hasn't heard the term before, adware is essentially an application that either collects sensitive information from you or your device, or inundates your device with really disruptive ads. Typically, they're out-of-app ads. So it's, if you're using a free app, you kind of expect to see ads within the application. It's when you shut that app and all of a sudden you have ads on your lock screen, that's considered adware. Most of what we've seen up until this point is really poorly written and not obfuscated at all. They don't even try to hide what they're doing. A lot of it, 99% of it, is financially motivated, so you can usually trace the money and figure out who is behind this particular campaign. And a 2013 report from Lookout showed that 6% of free apps contained adware. So not just ads, but actually ads that violated store policies. There are 3 common approaches to adware, and most of you have probably had some experience with these, or at least heard of them. The first is a synthetic audience, and that's essentially a way of saying fake clicks. So they have some sort of bot or some sort of automated clicking system within the application that makes it look like for some reason you are clicking 100 times on an ad that you're really not that interested in. Another interesting approach is to have unclickable ads, and we'll look at an example of this, but it's kind of similar to what you would see in the browser. It's essentially an ad that's loaded in an area where the user can't actually see it, can never actually click on it, but the advertiser thinks that you're watching it and that you have the ability to interact with the ad. And then, as we talked about, out-of-app advertisements. So, basically bombarding you with advertisements when you're not actually using an application. This was a pretty staggering statistic for me. According to Business Insider, in 2018, mobile in-app advertising fraud, so not just ads, but fraud, has surged as much as 800% over the previous year. I am very interested to see what they say for 2019, because I would suspect it's going to be more than 800%, which is a little crazy. And so now let's talk about why we should even care about adware. I mean, I feel like for most researchers, especially malware researchers, a lot of the time adware is kind of boring. Like I said, it's usually really poorly built. It's not very well obfuscated. It's kind of considered the low-hanging fruit of the research community. And some people see it as a victimless crime. I mean, if you're faking clicks, who's really getting hurt here? People aren't having money stolen from some sort of banking Trojan. It's not like you're dealing with some sophisticated surveillanceware or spyware that's, targeting political dissidents. It's essentially falsifying clicks for advertising revenue. So is it really hurting anybody other than maybe the advertising agencies? So we're going to look at that very briefly, but I think it's important to remember that adware targets everyone. So you don't have to be a political dissident. They kind of try to basically net as many people as they can, as many downloads as they can. And so you see a much larger sort of target audience. Some of the apps we'll look at, and specifically the app that I'm talking about in the case study, had about 500 million downloads. So that can actually generate quite a lot of revenue. And as we talked about, if ad companies are paying money for clicks or views that don't actually exist, that can impact the advertising industry. Now, again, maybe we don't care about that quite as much. But if we're looking at it from a personal standpoint, adware is the type of malware you're most likely to be affected by. In a really interesting Checkpoint report called State of Malware from 2019, they listed adware as still the most common malware affecting consumers and businesses year over year. So, that's not really surprising. As we said, they're trying to throw out a large net and get as many people as they can. So you're typically going to see that with this particular type of malware. But the impacts can be more than just falsifying clicks. They can actually be pretty substantial. So we're going to look at some interesting cases. This was from January 2019 from Upstream Systems. They released a report about an Alcatel weather app that did a whole bunch of things. But mostly what it was responsible for was generating false clicks, subscribing users to premium services, but it was also collecting some sensitive information, including your email, specifics on your device, and your location. And those were being sent to a third-party server in China that apparently did not have anything to do with the actual weather application. And then we have certain types of adware that actually display malicious advertisements. So you're not just dealing with falsifying clicks, you're actually dealing with the kind of advertisements that you're interacting with, or that someone who's using an application that should be trusted might be interacting with. One example is called Simbad. This was from Checkpoint Research, and they showed that in this particular family of adware, they were actually seeing advertisements for phishing sites. So that's real fun. Through a C2 server, the attacker could essentially decide what kind of phishing site they wanted to push out to applications, and they could modify it as they wanted to. And so you weren't just seeing ads, you were seeing some kind of browser activity that was saying that you had been logged out of Gmail and you better log back in or you're going to miss important emails. This one was particularly concerning. This was another case of malicious advertisements within adware, and this one was appropriately named Adult Swine, once again by Checkpoint. It had between 3 and 7 million downloads, and it essentially displayed porn to kids because most of the apps were actually gaming apps for children. So that's incredibly unfortunate. And then on top of that, it would actually trigger pop-ups saying, hey, your device has been infected by a malicious virus. The irony, you better go to Google Play and download this super great AV app. But of course, it wouldn't take you to Google Play. It would take you to some sketchy third-party site that was made to look like Google Play. And then finally, there's the case of device performance and usability and how that can be impacted by certain adware families. And that's where we're going to look at our main case study. This was a research project that I worked on for the better part of kind of the springtime. And like all great stories, it started with a Zendesk ticket. So a user contacted us saying that they were seeing very strange out-of-app advertisements on their device, primarily when their phone was locked. They were seeing advertisements on the lock screen, and they weren't entirely sure where it came from. They just knew that when they opened up the Android multitasking view, they saw some kind of app called Beta Plugin. And they told us the apps that they had recently downloaded, and so then I started digging. And there was exactly one mention of Beta Plugin on the internet, which is very strange, but it was actually a very helpful forum post. And this forum dated back to about 2017, and it was essentially a bunch of people complaining about the same, what they thought was an app, or a plugin maybe, called Beta Plugin. And they were listing all the different apps they had downloaded, the fact that they were seeing really kind of bombarded by different pop-ups on their device. They were seeing lock screen ads. Somebody actually said they missed a phone call because they went to go answer their phone, and instead of being able to actually answer the call, they got a 30-second video ad. So that sucks. There were also people who were so bombarded by these advertisements that their device had to be factory reset, because I guess they had multiple downloads of sort of like the carrier application. And so when I started investigating these different applications that were listed, you kind of saw a trend in the reviews. Despite the fact that they actually had pretty decent overall ratings, they were like 4 stars, 4.5 stars. Most of those 4 or 5-star reviews looked really fake, and the ones that didn't look very fake were usually 1 or 2 stars. So we can see added unwanted ads that locked my screen, put ads all over my phone without asking for permission. Horrible. So that was basically the trend. All of these apps had those same kind of reviews, and you could see a flagrant disregard for Google's Play Store policies. And so while I think most of us know that you're allowed to have ads within applications, Google is pretty strict about what kind of ads you can actually show. They don't allow disruptive ads or deceptive ads as well. So anything that's like a phishing ad or something trying to get you to download another application and falsifying that information, not allowed. Any apps that display ads outside of the application, once again, not allowed. So clearly there were some rules being broken here. And when I installed one of the applications on my test device, this is a picture of my screen, as you can see with the like lovely reflection in the back, as before I realized I could just take a screenshot of it. We see the same kind of thing. So this was a lock screen ad for tax cycle, I guess because April was coming up. And basically I figured out that within all of these applications, there was this particular plugin called beta plugin, just like we saw with the multitasking activity view on the Android device. What this ended up being was a very well obfuscated advertising plugin, and all of the carrier apps were pretty popular on Google Play, and we'll look at that in a second. But overall, there were 238 unique applications that contain this plugin. It was loaded as a DEX file via a loading class called Kihu360. I might be saying that wrong. The kind of funny thing about Kihu360 is that they're actually a cybersecurity company, and they're considered China's largest cybersecurity company, and they make an AV program. So that's funny. The loaded plugin is never actually installed to the device. So if you were to actually look through the installed applications, you would never see anything called beta. It's just loaded with the carrier application, and you have to essentially remove that application to remove the plugin. But the impacts were pretty significant. There was a significant battery depletion, lock screen advertisements, as I said, advertisements preventing the regular use of the phone, and then advertisements with accompanying audio while sleeping. And that's what I saw on my test device. So I just heard kind of like ghost music from somewhere. My test device had been sleeping on my desk, realized the audio was coming from my phone. And then when I kind of turned on the screen, there was a full screen video ad with music playing from my once sleeping device. So good times. 238 applications, and they had exactly 2 things in common. The first was that they contained the beta plugin, and the second thing was that they were all developed by this company called CooTek. This is where the story gets pretty interesting because CooTek is actually a publicly traded company on the New York Stock Exchange. They were founded in 2008 in Shanghai, and they've actually won a fair number of awards. They were rated as one of the top 10 most innovative companies in China by Fast Company. They won an award from Google for Best of Play Apps 2015. They IPO'd in 2018. And according to CooTek, in 2019, their global products reached an average of 255.5 million monthly active users around the world. So they're pretty popular. And some of you might recognize this app because this is their flagship app. It's called TouchPal. It's essentially a third-party keyboard. So if you really want to have a keyboard that looks like a starfish, you can do that. It's incredibly popular. It has, millions and millions and millions of downloads. But on top of this particular application, they also developed some others like HiFit or ManFit or Step Tracker, and a bunch of others that were actually published under different developer names, but you can actually trace back to CooTek using some good old open source intelligence. And the cumulative installs for all of the apps that CooTek developed that were available on Google Play and contained the plugin was over 500 million. So they had a substantial user base. So what makes this particular family interesting is that we had 238 apps, most of which were incredibly popular. And they were, very obviously violating Google Play Store policies. So how were they able to actually sneak past any of the tests that Google Bouncer has in play? This is where we look at some of the fun code. So they evaded Google Bouncer in a number of ways. One of the first ways was that they didn't actually trigger any malicious activity until a certain time had passed. Sometimes this was randomized even. So for my test device, the reason why I had this ghost music playing was because it took 2 weeks to actually see any activity on the device. They also had conditional checks in place to make sure that the device wasn't an emulator. It wouldn't trigger any malicious activity if it suspected or it recognized that you had USB debugging enabled or that ADB was enabled. So they would kind of suspect that you could be a researcher and trying to figure out what they were up to. They checked whether auto time and auto time zone settings were in place and then wouldn't trigger any of the malicious activity if they were. And then they had some really fun anti-debug measures that made stepping through the application in a debugger pretty much impossible. It would just crash all the time. So the only real success I had, like I said, was installing it on my device and just letting it go to town. And thankfully it did. What was interesting as well about these particular apps is that the plugin itself was refactored over time. So just like you see with regular software projects, this too had different iterations and different versions. In earlier versions, the actual DEX file that was responsible for the plugin was unencrypted, and it was called beta.rec, and it lived within the assets directory. And in later versions, this was actually renamed to icomoon-gemini.renc. And I'm not entirely sure if this is why, but I suspect they named it that because there is like a vector pack for developers called icomoon, and there is a compatible download for that like vector pack called Gemini. So I'm assuming that they named it this so they could make it look like these were just like icon packs that you were using with your app. I'm not entirely sure if that's right, but it just seems like an interesting coincidence. And when they renamed the beta.rec DEX file to icomoon, they encrypted it with AES. And like I said, in both cases, these were actually just Dalvik executable files, which are loaded by a plugin, the Kihu 360 plugin loader. So the AES encryption key it actually exists within the code base of the main application. It's obfuscated through like a whole bunch of different methods. You have to kind of follow through this maze of connected things. It was a pain in the butt to go through. But essentially, it's called in a package called Hades SDK, which doesn't sound ominous at all. So you can see right there, the function is called get encrypted key. And there's also within Hades another function that's responsible for retrieving the asset path where the plugin's located. So I guess if they wanted to change up where they were storing the plugin or the name of the plugin, they could change that here. Very handy for future versions. And what's interesting for this Hades SDK package, all of the classes within this package were responsible for pretty much all of the interaction between the plugin and the ad libraries once it was loaded. There were also checks for whether the plugin had been decrypted, loaded. Hades specified the output of the jar file that was generated. It set alarms to trigger the ad-related intents. And it also specified spaces for the ads to appear. And this is one example where they really weren't trying to obfuscate where they were going to display the ads because it's literally called lock screen. That made my life easier. But what's interesting about Hades is that you don't actually see it initialized if you just look through, if you step through like the regular flow of the Android application when you're reversing it. So the Hades SDK is actually initialized by a subclass that's defined in the manifest, and that subclass is com.scanner.qrc application. If we go to QRC application, hopefully this will play. There's no audio, it's just video. It's sort of hard to see, but you can essentially see that in QRC application, if you kind of step backward through all of the super.onCreate methods there that are being called, we end up in the Hades SDK. I mean, this one's just called CooTek.bbase. So here we can see this is within the Hades SDK, and it's calling the Kihu 360 replugin app. So that is where it's loading the DEX file. All that to basically say that you had to kind of step through different versions, different classes to actually get your way to Hades from that initial initializer subclass. No. Okay, that just played it automatically. There we go. Okay, so other than the actual plugin going through different iterations of obfuscation, not being encrypted, being encrypted. The same thing was true of any of the classes that were responsible for dealing with Hades SDK, the plugin itself, all that good stuff. So earlier versions dating back to about 2018, all of the strings were hard-coded and not obfuscated. But later, especially in all the versions where we saw the DEX file called the ICO-moon name, all of the strings related to any plugin activity were XOR encrypted and base64 encoded, like you can see over here. And I just have the little comment showing what it actually says if it wasn't encrypted and encoded. But for every single class, they actually had their own string as the encryption string. So for the Hades SDK package, all of those classes were encrypted with this Robin High string. What was fun about this was that these were all encrypted using a public encryption library, I guess you want to call it, called StringFog, which is appropriately named. And you too can find it on GitHub because it's open source and free. So that made figuring that out a lot easier. And each of these classes facilitates something to do with loading the plugin or interacting with the plugin or loading the ad libraries or figuring out where the plugin was located. So what does this mean for the future of adware? And what does this mean for researchers? Because we're seeing a pretty significant increase in the number of applications that are using more sophisticated approaches to creating these kind of adware applications and trying to basically monopolize on the popularity of their applications. So this was a kind of stressful situation, but it worked out kind of interestingly. So we reported all of these apps to Google. And then in June 2019, I published my research. And that day, CooTek stock dropped 20%. So that was a really fun getting a DM from their PR lady. She was not pleased. They removed the plugin from a few of their apps and uploaded versions. And of course, released some statements. But after a couple of weeks, we actually saw that the plugin wasn't really removed from many of the applications that had updated versions. So it looked like they had uploaded a new version, but it was really the same. And in fact, in some of the applications, they had removed the specific plugin, but they had taken the plugin code and they said they refactored it. They did. They refactored it to do the same thing within other areas of the kind of carrier application. So there was no longer a plugin that was being loaded. They just kind of moved all the code over. So we notified Google of this again. And at that point, Google temporarily removed all of the apps from the Play Store. And then it actually banned them from the advertising platform. And their stock dropped 30%. And then at the end of August, by that point, their stock had dropped 40% of the original value. So this was an interesting case study of seeing what happens when these kind of big name players are caught essentially trying to bend the rules and thinking they won't get caught because it had some pretty devastating consequences. I really love this quote because I think it accurately reflects what's happening to the industry right now, if you want to call it the adware industry. But it's from a Checkpoint researcher, and he says, you're starting to see actors realizing that just regular adware won't do these days. If you want the big money, you need to invest in infrastructure and research and development. And so that's what we were seeing with companies like CooTek that are, multi-million-dollar companies. They have the dollars for research and development, and we can see them iterating on the development of their software, not just in terms of the actual software application, but also, the kind of malicious activity that goes on behind the scenes. So we're seeing this shift in the industry, essentially. This is by no means an isolated case for 2019. There were a number of other companies that did something similar. Do Global was banned from Google Play in April 2019. And at this point, this was considered the largest banning, I guess, of developers from Google Play. They had about 100 apps in the Play Store and something like 500 million number of downloads. So that was a pretty substantial banning. And we're seeing a really considerable increase in the number of these more sophisticated and obfuscated adware apps. So we're no longer just seeing these kind of poorly built apps that you could kind of look through a couple of classes and know exactly what they're doing. People are getting really creative. So one example is an app that was, I would say released, but it is a family of apps that were discovered in 2019 called Preammo. And it actually connected to 3 different ad frameworks using 3 different methods in order to try and sort of dissuade researchers from necessarily convicting them based on just like one of those methods. So essentially, you'd have to figure out all the 3 different ways that they were connecting to all the 3 different ad networks and potentially create some kind of heuristic to notify your antivirus software based on those. ForShared is a file storage app that was quite popular, and that was in the news a lot, I believe, this summer. And they did something really creative. As we talked about the unclickable ads, they actually just used invisible overlays. So they would have these invisible overlays over their actual application. And then anytime the user was interacting with the application, it would register as a click or a view for different ads. So that's kind of creative. And then finally, Agent Smith, which is a nice reference to the Matrix here. This adware started as kind of just like a really clunky, crappy piece of adware that didn't really do much other than display out-of-app ads. And then they actually iterated over it to eventually create this adware that would essentially go through all of the installed applications that a user had on their device, see if they had any matching applications that they had kind of like Trojanized versions of, and then install their own versions of those applications in order to continue to propagate ads. So, I mean, the reference to Agent Smith is just like duplicating itself to try and just get more ads to display on your device and therefore have more revenue dollars for the whoever's developing this stuff. And then we're also seeing more actors actually relying on using legitimate infrastructure. And this makes all of their network traffic just appear a little bit more legitimate. So that's sort of an easy way that they've sort of tried to fool researchers or antivirus software to not have them convicted. So what does this mean for the future of adware? As I said, we're seeing an increase in the amount of obfuscation, and that means that there is less low-hanging fruit for researchers like me to basically convict things right away. You have to do a little bit more digging. And it's more challenging for not only researchers, but certain antivirus solutions or, kind of deterrents like Google Bouncer to actually convict these adware families outright. We're seeing a continued introduction of ad plugins or functionality that sort of crosses the border between appropriate and inappropriate ways of serving ads and policy violations for these different app stores, and not just with Google Play, but with others as well. And then, of course, what we've talked about, and the prime example from our case study being CooTek, with these larger and considered reputable companies actually investing research and development dollars to produce these more sophisticated and novel ways of circumventing AV checks to kind of get their ads delivered to more people without being caught. So this kind of marks a really interesting change in the future of what was once considered kind of like the not so exciting malware to sort of investigate. And it'll be interesting to see what 2020 brings, because I think people are going to have to get more creative. So thank you so much for listening. I think for questions, I will just be behind the registration desk if you have anything you want to talk about. Thanks so much.